Welcome to this journey into the forgotten corners of American history, where the line between documented fact and whispered legend becomes impossibly thin. I'm your guide through these archived terrors, and tonight we delve into a case that has haunted Colorado's historical records for over a century. Before we begin, I'd like to know, where are you watching this from and what time is it there? Are you alone in the darkness or surrounded by the comfort of daylight? Leave a comment below. Our community thrives on shared experiences, and your presence here matters. Now let me take you back to March 1909, to a place that no longer exists on any modern map, Iron Peak, Colorado. Nestled deep within the unforgiving terrain of the Rocky Mountains, Iron Peak was a mining settlement that thrived briefly during the final gasps of the Colorado silver boom. By 1909, the town housed approximately 240 souls, clinging to prosperity that had already begun to fade. The mines still produced, though less generously than before. The general store still opened its doors each morning. Children still attended the one-room schoolhouse where Miss Sarah Mitchell taught reading and arithmetic. It was, by all accounts, an unremarkable town facing an unremarkable decline, destined to become just another ghost town scattered across the American West. But Iron Peak's fate would be anything but ordinary. On the night of March 3rd, 1909, beneath a moon so full it cast shadows sharp as daylight, 28-year-old Robert Anderson failed to return from his shift at the Clearwater mine. Robert was known as a reliable man, steady and punctual, the kind of worker mine foremen valued. His absence was noted immediately. When the search party ventured out the following morning, they discovered something that would change Iron Peak forever. Robert's lunch pail lay overturned in the snow, approximately 300 yards from the mine entrance. His lamp had been extinguished, the glass shattered, but it was what surrounded these items that sent a chill through even the most hardened miners. Tracks. Not human tracks, not bear tracks, not wolf tracks, though they resembled the latter most closely. These prints measured nearly 14 inches in length, with claw marks extending an additional 3 inches beyond the toe pads. The stride between prints measured an impossible 7 feet. Whatever had made these tracks had been running on 2 legs, not 4. The trail led directly to the tree line, where it vanished into the dense forest as if the creature had simply ceased to exist. Robert Anderson's body was never found. The official report filed with the San Miguel County Sheriff's Office listed the cause of disappearance as presumed animal attack, victim deceased. The case was closed within a week. Iron Peak's residents held a memorial service. Robert's younger sister traveled from Denver to collect his belongings. Life, it seemed, would continue. But the tracks in the snow told a different story. And those who saw them, those who measured them, those who followed them into the tree line, where the scent of something ancient and wrong still lingered in the frozen air, they knew. Something was hunting in Iron Peak, something that walked like a man but was not a man. And March 3rd, 1909, had been the night of the full moon. What happened in the weeks and months that followed would force an entire community to confront a truth more terrifying than any natural predator, that the mountains they had carved into, the earth they had violated for silver and profit, held secrets older than their nation, older than their very conception of reality. This is the story of the Midnight Howler of Iron Peak, a case that remains officially unexplained to this day, buried in archives that few have ever examined. Until now. To understand what befell Iron Peak, we must first understand the world these people inhabited. The year 1909 marked a transitional period in American history. The Wild West was dying, transforming into something more civilized, yet somehow less honest. Colorado had achieved statehood 23 years prior, but settlements like Iron Peak remained frontier outposts, isolated by geography and temperament from the rapidly modernizing cities along the Front Range. Iron Peak itself had been established in 1878 during the Great Colorado Silver Rush that followed the discovery of rich deposits throughout the San Juan Mountains. The Clearwater mine, the town's primary employer, had produced steadily for 3 decades, but by 1909 the vein was running thin. Experienced miners could read the signs. Another year, perhaps 2, and the operation would close. Families had begun to leave, seeking opportunities in Denver, Pueblo, or the new boomtowns further west. Those who remained formed a tight-knit community, bound by necessity and isolation. The nearest neighboring settlement, Silverton, lay 18 miles distant, over treacherous mountain roads that became impassable during winter storms. For months at a time, Iron Peak existed as its own isolated world, cut off from outside communication, dependent entirely on its own resources. The town's social center was the Copper Bell boarding house, operated by 34-year-old widow Phoebe Davis. Phoebe had arrived in Iron Peak 7 years earlier with her late husband, a mining engineer who had died in a cave-in during the winter of 1904. Rather than return east, she had purchased the boarding house with her husband's life insurance settlement and transformed it into the community's unofficial gathering place. According to letters preserved in the Colorado Historical Society archives, Phoebe was known for her practical nature and sharp intellect. She kept meticulous records of her boarders, maintained an extensive library despite the town's isolation, and was one of the few residents who subscribed to newspapers from Denver and even New York. Her contemporaries described her as a woman of modern sensibilities, trapped in a medieval landscape. The town's medical care fell to Dr. Jason White, a 31-year-old physician who had arrived in 1907. Dr. White's private journals, discovered decades later in a trunk in his family's Denver estate, reveal a man simultaneously fascinated and frustrated by frontier medicine. He treated everything from mining accidents to childbirth to frostbite, often with inadequate supplies and no possibility of consultation with more experienced colleagues. Education was provided by Miss Sarah Mitchell, 26 years old, who had come to Iron Peak in 1908 from Boston. Her employment records indicate she was the daughter of a minister and had trained at a normal school before accepting the teaching position. Letters to her sister describe Iron Peak as beautiful in its desolation, though the isolation weighs heavily upon the spirit. These 3 individuals, Phoebe, Dr. White, and Sarah, would become the primary investigators of the horrors that unfolded. But to understand those horrors, we must examine the town's darkest resident, Colonel Edmund Martin. Edmund Martin was 67 years old in 1909, a veteran of the Civil War who had served with distinction in the Union Army before joining the Western campaigns during the Indian Wars. He had been among the first settlers of Iron Peak, arriving in 1878 with sufficient capital to establish himself as a partial owner of the Clearwater mine. Martin lived alone in a large cabin on the outskirts of town, employing no servants despite his relative wealth. He was known as a recluse, venturing into town only for essential supplies. The miners respected his business acumen, but found his manner unsettling. Children crossed the street to avoid passing his property. What few knew was that Edmund Martin carried secrets from a time before Iron Peak existed. In the archives of the National Archives and Records Administration, there exists a military document dated August 1867 listing Colonel Edmund Martin among the officers present at what was officially termed the pacification operation in the San Miguel River Valley. The document is sparse in details, noting only that hostile elements were neutralized, and that the operation resulted in the securing of mineral-rich territories for American settlement. What this sanitized language conceals is a massacre. The Ute people had inhabited the Colorado territories for centuries. Before American expansion, the land where Iron Peak would eventually stand was considered sacred ground, particularly a series of caves in the mountainside where shamans performed vision quests and spiritual ceremonies. When silver was discovered, these considerations became irrelevant to the United States government and the mining interests that influenced its policies. On August 14, 1867, Colonel Edmund Martin led a company of soldiers in an assault on a Ute encampment located precisely where the Clearwater mine would later be dug. Contemporary accounts, discovered in a private collection of letters sold at auction in 1987, described the attack as swift and total. Men, women, and children were killed. The camp was burned. The caves were sealed with explosives. One letter written by a private who served under Martin describes a disturbing detail. As the soldiers departed, the surviving Ute shaman, mortally wounded, performed a ritual curse, speaking words in a language none of the soldiers understood. The private wrote, "The colonel seemed stricken by those words, though he claimed not to understand them. That night, and for many nights after, he suffered terrible dreams." Edmund Martin never spoke of that day. He resigned from the military in 1870, spent 8 years wandering the territories, and finally returned to the very land where the massacre had occurred, using his military pension and unexplained wealth to establish himself as a founding member of Iron Peak. For 42 years he had lived on that cursed ground, and now, in March 1909, something had awakened. The disappearance of Robert Anderson was not the beginning, as the community would soon discover. It was merely the first death they could not ignore. There had been signs, warnings, omens that the residents had explained away or attributed to natural causes. Livestock had been found dead throughout the winter, torn apart with a savagery that suggested no ordinary predator. Howls echoed through the mountains on nights when the moon was full, sounds that resembled wolves but carried a quality that made men's blood run cold. And more than one resident reported dreams of being pursued through the forest by something that ran upright, something with human intelligence behind inhuman eyes. The stage was set, the players were in position, and as March progressed toward the next full moon, Iron Peak would discover that some debts can never be forgiven, some ground can never be cleansed, and some curses can never be broken. They simply wait, patient as stone, for the proper time to collect what they are owed. The days following Robert Anderson's disappearance brought an uneasy calm to Iron Peak. The official explanation, animal attack, satisfied most residents on a surface level. Mountain lions occasionally wandered down from higher elevations. Bears, though typically hibernating in March, could wake hungry and aggressive. These were known dangers, part of the calculus, of frontier life. But Phoebe Davis was not satisfied. In her journal entry dated March 5, 1909, preserved now in the Western History Collection at the Denver Public Library, she wrote, "The men speak confidently of mountain lions and bears, as if giving a name to the terror will diminish it, but I measured those tracks myself before the snow melted. No natural animal leaves such prints. The stride alone defies rational explanation. Something walked through our town on 2 legs, something large, enough to carry away a full-grown man without leaving a trail of blood or signs of struggle beyond the initial attack site." Phoebe began her own investigation with characteristic methodical precision. She interviewed everyone who had been outdoors the night of March 3rd. She compiled their testimonies in a leather-bound notebook that would later become crucial evidence in understanding what transpired. Thomas Greer, a miner who lived in a cabin near the tree line, reported hearing howls between midnight and 1 in the morning. "Not wolf howls," he insisted to Phoebe. "I've heard wolves my entire life, Mum. These were different, deeper, more intentional, if that makes sense, like something trying to communicate rather than simply expressing an urge." Margaret Sullivan, who ran the general store, had been awake tending to her sick infant. She described seeing a shadow pass across her window, something too tall to be a man walking but shaped wrong to be a man on horseback. The shadow had paused at her fence line, and she had heard breathing, heavy and laboured, before it moved on toward the forest. Most disturbing was the testimony of 10-year-old David Hutchins. The boy had disobeyed his parents and sneaked out to retrieve a toy he'd left near the schoolhouse. He claimed to have seen the Colonel walking toward the woods, but different, ma'am, bigger somehow, and his coat looked strange, like it was part of him. When Phoebe questioned the boy further, he became agitated and refused to elaborate. His mother later begged Phoebe to leave the child alone, claiming the incident had given him terrible nightmares. Dr. Jason White conducted his own investigation from a medical perspective. In his journal entry from March 7th, he noted, "I have examined the photographs taken of the tracks before the snow melt. The morphology is impossible. The foot structure suggests plantigrade locomotion, walking on the full sole of the foot as humans do, but the proportions are all wrong. The elongation of the metatarsals, the pronounced claw development, the width of the pad. It's as if someone attempted to create a wolf's paw, but scaled it to fit a human leg structure. Nature does not produce such hybrids." Dr. White also made a disturbing discovery while reviewing his medical records. Over the past 6 months, Colonel Edmund Martin had visited him 3 times, always late in the evening, always paying in cash rather than establishing credit, as was customary. The complaints were vague: joint pain, particularly in the hands and feet, episodes of fever coinciding with the lunar cycle, and insomnia. Most significantly, during the last visit on February 28th, just 3 days before Robert Anderson's disappearance, the Colonel had requested a specific medication, a powerful sedative typically reserved for patients suffering from violent episodes or delirium. "I need to sleep," Martin had told him, according to the doctor's notes. "There are nights when I cannot trust myself." Dr. White had prescribed a moderate dose, nothing that would have raised alarm at the time. But now, reviewing this conversation in light of subsequent events, he felt a creeping dread he could not entirely rationalize. Sarah Mitchell contributed her own observations. As the school teacher, she maintained regular contact with most of the town's families. In the weeks leading up to Robert's disappearance, she had noticed a pattern. Children arriving at school exhausted, reporting nightmares of being chased through the woods by something that called their names in voices they almost recognized. "At first, I attributed it to the isolation," she wrote in a letter to her sister dated March 10th. "Winter in these mountains is psychologically taxing, particularly for young minds, but the consistency of the imagery troubled me. Multiple children from different families describing essentially the same dream, a figure that is both man and beast, standing at the edge of the forest, beckoning them to follow, and always, they say, the figure wears military medals." The 3 investigators, Phoebe, Dr. White, and Sarah, began meeting secretly at the boarding house to share their findings. They were united by a recognition that the official explanation was inadequate, but divided on what the truth might actually be. Dr. White favored a rational explanation. Perhaps a severely disturbed individual living in the mountains, possibly affected by a degenerative brain condition that caused violent episodes. The tracks could have been created artificially to confuse investigators. Sarah, influenced by her religious upbringing, considered supernatural explanations but struggled to reconcile them with her educated worldview. Phoebe remained coldly analytical, unwilling to commit to any theory without additional evidence. That evidence arrived on the night of March 18th. The moon was waxing toward fullness, though it would not reach its peak until March 21st. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and a light snow had begun to fall, dampening sound and creating an eerie silence over the town. At approximately 11:30, screams erupted from the northern edge of Iron Peak. James Keller, a 42-year-old mine foreman, had been walking home from a late shift when something attacked him near the old smelter building. His cries brought residents running from their homes, lamps in hand, to find Keller alive but severely injured. Dr. White, summoned immediately, treated 4 deep lacerations across Keller's back and shoulder. The wounds were consistent with claw marks, but their size and depth suggested an animal far larger than any native to Colorado. More significantly, Keller was conscious and able to speak. "It was walking," he gasped as Dr. White stitched his wounds, standing upright like a man, 7 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark fur, but the face... He shuddered. The face was almost human. It looked at me with human eyes, intelligent, knowing, and it spoke. The room fell silent. "What did it say?" Phoebe asked quietly. Keller's voice dropped to a whisper. "It said, 'You should not be here. None of you should be here. The debt grows with every moon.'" Dr. White pressed for more details. What language had the creature used? Was Keller certain he hadn't imagined the words due to trauma and fear? But Keller insisted. The voice had been rough, barely human, but the words were clear and in English. And there was something else, something he almost hadn't mentioned, because it seemed impossible. As the creature had turned to flee back into the forest, Keller had glimpsed something metallic on its chest, catching the lamplight. A medal, a military medal, the kind worn by Union officers during the Civil War. "Before we continue, I want to hear from you. What do you think is happening in Iron Peak? Is this a curse manifesting physically or something else entirely? Share your theories in the comments below. Our community thrives on different perspectives, and your insights might reveal connections I haven't considered." The next day, March 19th, a delegation of townspeople, led by mine owner Harrison Webb, demanded a meeting with Colonel Edmund Martin. They marched to his cabin with righteous anger, determined to confront him about the growing suspicions. But when they arrived, they found the colonel's cabin door hanging open, swinging in the wind. The interior had been destroyed. Furniture overturned, walls gouged with deep scratches, floorboards torn up as if something had been digging frantically beneath the house. Blood stained the floor in patterns that suggested a violent struggle, though no body was present. Most disturbing was what they found in the colonel's bedroom. A journal, its pages filled with increasingly erratic handwriting, lay open on the bed. The final entry was dated March 17th, 2 days prior, and consisted of a single sentence repeated over and over. "Until the ink ran dry. I cannot hold it back anymore. God forgive me. I cannot hold it back anymore." The full moon was 2 days away, and Colonel Edmund Martin had vanished into the mountains. The discovery of Colonel Edmund Martin's ransacked cabin sent shockwaves through Iron Peak's remaining population. While the mining delegation searched the destroyed home, Phoebe Davis made a decision that would prove crucial to understanding the true nature of what haunted the mountains. She took the journal. In her later testimony to state investigators, documented in the San Miguel County records, she explained, "I knew if left to the mining company's officials or the sheriff's office when they eventually arrived, that journal would disappear into bureaucratic obscurity. The truth mattered more than protocol." That evening, Phoebe, Dr. White, and Sarah Mitchell gathered in the boarding house's private parlor to examine the journal in its entirety. What they discovered within those pages would shatter their understanding of reality. The journal spanned 42 years, beginning in August 1867 and ending with the desperate final entry they had already seen. The early entries documented Edmund Martin's military service in clinical detached language, troop movements, supply requisitions, routine patrol reports, the mundane record-keeping of an army officer. But on August 15, 1867, the day after the massacre, the tone changed dramatically. "We buried them in the caves they held. Sacred," Martin had written. Captain Holbrook said it was efficient, one location, easily sealed with explosives. I gave the order to set the charges. The shaman was still alive when we laid him among his dead. He looked at me with eyes that held no fear, only certainty. He spoke in his tongue, words that sounded like wind through dead trees, and then he repeated them in broken English so I would understand. "You wear the wolf's skin now, soldier. Every full moon the wolf will wear yours." I shot him then. A mercy, I told myself, but his eyes remained open, watching me, even after death. That night I dreamed I was running through the forest on 4 legs, tasting blood. The entries over the following months detailed Martin's deteriorating mental state. He described recurring nightmares, persistent joint pain, and an increasing sensitivity to the lunar cycle. In October 1867, 3 months after the massacre, he recorded the first transformation. "I woke in the forest, naked and covered in blood. My hands, I can still see my hands. They were torn and raw, as if I had been digging in the earth with bare fingers. There was meat in my teeth. Animal meat, I prayed. I have no memory of the night itself, only flashes, running, hunting, the taste of fear in the air." Martin resigned from the military shortly after, attempting to outrun the curse by traveling constantly. But the transformations continued, occurring with each full moon. He learned to isolate himself during these periods, to chain himself in remote locations, to take sedatives that might suppress the change. Nothing worked. In 1878, driven by a compulsion he described as the wolf's instinct for territory, Martin returned to the site of the massacre. He established Iron Peak, built his cabin precisely over the sealed caves, and spent the next 3 decades attempting to contain the curse while living atop its source. "Perhaps proximity to the origin would allow me control," he wrote in 1880. "Or perhaps, I am drawn here because the wolf knows this is its hunting ground. I no longer distinguish between my will and its hunger." For years, Martin had managed to maintain control during the transformations. He would retreat to his cabin, lock himself in a reinforced room he had built in the cellar, and emerge the next morning exhausted, but having harmed no one. But the journal revealed that his control had been weakening. In 1906, 3 years before the events of March 1909, he recorded killing an elk during a transformation. In 1907, he attacked a prospector who had wandered too close to his property, though he managed to stop himself before delivering a fatal blow. By 1908, entire pages were covered with frantic scribblings about losing time, finding blood on his clothing with no memory of how it got there, and hearing the wolf's thoughts, even when the moon was dark. The final dated entries, from March 1909, documented his complete psychological collapse. March 1st. "I can feel it, growing stronger. The sedatives no longer work. Dr. White cannot prescribe anything powerful enough. In 3 days the moon will be full, and I know, I will not be able to contain it this time. I should leave. I should walk into the mountains and put a bullet in my skull. But the wolf won't let me. It wants what it has been denied for 42 years. March 2nd. I tried to warn them. I stood at the edge of town tonight in human form and wanted to scream, 'Run! All of you, run!' But the words would not come. The wolf is already taking control. It knows these people, their schedules, their vulnerabilities. It has been watching through my eyes for years." March 3rd. Tonight, it takes the first one. I have chosen Robert Anderson because he is young and strong, and the wolf respects worthy prey. God forgive me, I have already selected the others who will follow. The debt must be paid in full. The shaman's curse demands balance, a life for each life taken in the massacre. 43 souls died in those caves. 43 must be returned to the earth before the curse releases me. Dr. White's hands trembled as he finished reading the entry aloud. He's counting, the doctor whispered. He's systematically selecting victims to fulfill some insane requirement he believes the curse demands. Sarah Mitchell, her face pale, pointed to a page near the journal's end. There's a list. Names. 22 of them, including Robert Anderson and James Keller. Phoebe scanned the list quickly. Her blood ran cold. These are all men who work at the Clearwater mine. He's targeting the miners specifically. The mine is built on the massacre site, Dr. White said, understanding dawning. In his mind, or in the curse's logic, those who profit from the desecrated ground must pay the price. Sarah's voice was barely audible. We're all on this list. Everyone who has participated in the mining operation. My name is here too. I teach the miners' children. Phoebe, you house. The mine workers. Doctor, you treat them. We're all complicit in his eyes. The implication was clear. Colonel Edmund Martin, or the creature he became, intended to kill 21 more people before the curse was satisfied, and they had less than 48 hours until the next full moon. The discovery of Martin's intentions forced Phoebe, Dr. White, and Sarah to make a critical decision. They could share the journal with the wider community, potentially causing mass panic and exodus, or they could attempt to stop Martin themselves before the next full moon. They chose the latter, though their reasoning differed. Dr. White maintained hope that Martin could be reasoned with in his human form, possibly treated if they could locate him before the transformation. Sarah believed that confronting the curse at its source, the sealed caves, might offer a spiritual solution. Phoebe, ever pragmatic, simply noted that alerting the authorities would take too long, and by the time help arrived from Silverton or Denver, more people would be dead. On the morning of March 20th, they equipped themselves with lamps, rope, and tools borrowed from the mine and set out to locate the sealed caves mentioned in Martin's journal. The journal included rough maps drawn from memory, showing the cave entrance's location relative to where his cabin now stood. Following these directions led them to a section of the mountain face approximately half a mile from the Clearwater mine's main shaft. At first glance, there was nothing to indicate caves had ever existed there. The rock face appeared solid, marked only by natural erosion patterns and vegetation growth. But closer inspection revealed anomalies, areas where the rock's color didn't quite match its surroundings, suggestions of artificial smoothing inconsistent with natural geological processes. Dr. White, running his hands across the surface, found what they were searching for. Explosive scars, 4 decades old but still identifiable to anyone familiar with mining techniques. They used black powder charges to seal it, he said. The explosion collapsed the entrance and brought down enough material to bury the opening. But caves this size don't simply disappear. The system still exists behind this wall. It took them 6 hours to excavate an opening large enough to enter. The work was grueling, made more difficult by their need for secrecy. If the mining company discovered they were conducting unauthorized excavation on company land, they would be stopped immediately. By late afternoon, they had created a gap barely 3 feet wide, but sufficient for a person to squeeze through. Sarah volunteered to enter first. Her smaller frame made navigation easier, and despite her fear, her determination to understand the spiritual dimensions of the curse drove her forward. What she found inside stopped her breath. The cave system had been partially collapsed by the explosives, but large chambers, remained intact. And these chambers were not empty. "Oh God," she called back to the others. "Oh God, you need to see this." Phoebe and Dr. White squeezed through the opening, their lamps illuminating a sight that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Bones, dozens of human skeletons, arranged in positions suggesting they had been attempting to flee when the entrance collapsed. Men, women, children, entire families frozen in their final moments of terror. But it was not the massacre victims that horrified them. Most, among the 42-year-old remains, were newer additions, much newer. 3 bodies in various states of decomposition lay scattered throughout the main chamber. The most recent appeared to have been dead less than a week. Even in the lamplight, even after predation and decay, the victims were identifiable by their clothing and personal effects. Robert Anderson and 2 other miners who had been reported missing over the past 6 months, disappearances attributed to desertion or tragic accidents in the mountains. Martin had been bringing his victims here, to the site of the original massacre, creating a grotesque symmetry between past and present deaths. Dr. White knelt beside Robert's remains, his medical training allowing him to maintain composure despite the horror. Cause of death appears to be massive trauma to the throat and chest. The claw marks are consistent with what we saw on James Keller, but there's something else. He pointed to markings carved into the cave wall, near each body. Symbols drawn in what appeared to be a mixture of blood and ash created a pattern around the chamber. Sarah recognized them immediately. These are Ute spiritual symbols. I've seen similar designs in anthropological texts at the library. They're used in transformation rituals, ceremonies meant to blur the boundary between human and animal spirits. Martin's been completing the ritual, Phoebe said, understanding, crystallizing. The shaman cursed him to become the wolf, but Martin's attempting to extend the curse, to make it permanent. He's not just killing to satisfy some cosmic debt. He's trying to fully transform, to abandon his humanity entirely. A sound echoed from deeper within the cave system, a scraping, deliberate noise, like claws on stone. All 3 froze. "He's here," Dr. White whispered. "He's been here the entire time, watching us." From the darkness beyond their lamplight came a voice, rough and barely human, but unmistakably Colonel Edmund Martin's. "You should not have come here. The transformation is nearly complete. After tonight's moon, I will never be human again. The wolf will take everything, and the debt will be paid in full. 21 more must die. The shaman's curse demands it." "Colonel, please," Sarah called into the darkness. "We can help you. This doesn't have to continue." Laughter echoed through the caves, a sound that held both human anguish and animal mockery. "Help me? I am beyond help. I have been beyond help for 42 years. But you 3 have complicated matters. You were not on the list. You do not work the mind directly. But now you have entered the sacred ground. Now you have disturbed the dead. Now you too are marked." Movement in the shadows, too large and too fast to be entirely human. "Run," Phoebe said quietly. "Run now." They fled toward the narrow entrance they had excavated, lamplight bouncing wildly as they scrambled over uneven stone. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew, louder. Not quite footsteps, not quite the padding of paws, but something between the two. Sarah reached the opening first, squeezing through with desperate speed. Dr. White followed, abandoning his lamp in his haste. Phoebe was last, and as she pulled herself through the gap, she felt something grab her ankle with crushing force. She kicked frantically, her boot connecting with something that felt like bone beneath coarse fur. The grip released, and she tumbled through the opening, landing hard on the rocky slope outside. In the last moment before she cleared the gap, her lamp illuminated what held her. It was Martin, but also not Martin. The transformation was incomplete, a hideous middle state between man and beast. The face was elongated, but still recognizably human. The body covered in patches of dark fur mixed with bare skin, the hands terminating in claws that had not fully formed. And the eyes, those were entirely human, filled with an agony that transcended physical pain. "Help! Me!" those eyes pleaded, even as the mouth formed words of threat. "Kill me, please, before tonight." Then the lamp went dark, and he disappeared back into the caves. The three investigators stumbled down the mountain as the sun began to set, knowing that in a few hours the full moon would rise and Colonel Edmund Martin's transformation would complete. They had less than 3 hours to warn the town and prepare for what was coming. 3 hours before the midnight howler would hunt in earnest. What happened on the night of March 21st, 1909, remains officially undocumented. No police reports exist. No newspaper articles from that period mention Iron Peak beyond routine mining production notices. The town simply ceased to exist in public records after that date. But fragments survived, pieces of the truth scattered across decades, discovered by those curious or unfortunate enough to go searching. The first substantial evidence emerged in 1952 when a geological survey team from the Colorado School of Mines conducted a resource assessment in the San Miguel mountain range. The team's leader, Professor Raymond Thatcher, kept detailed field notes that were donated to the university's archives upon his death in 1978. In his entry dated June 14, 1952, Professor Thatcher described stumbling upon the ruins of an abandoned mining settlement, identity unknown. The description matches Iron Peak's location precisely. The town appeared to have been evacuated suddenly, Thatcher wrote. Buildings remained standing, though weathered by 4 decades of neglect. Personal belongings were scattered throughout. Furniture, clothing, even children's toys. It resembled photographs I've seen of Pompeii, as if the residents had vanished mid-activity. Most disturbing were the claw marks. Every structure bore deep gouges in the wood, concentrated around doors and windows, as if something had attempted to break inside from the outside, or prevent escape. Professor Thatcher's team spent 3 days surveying the ghost town. On the second day, they discovered the Copperbell boarding house, its structure remarkably intact despite the passage of time. In a locked room on the second floor, they found a steamer trunk containing documents, Phoebe Davis's personal papers, including her journal and the notebook where she had compiled witness testimonies. These documents were turned over to the Colorado Historical Society, where they sat largely unexamined until 1967, when a graduate student named Linda Morales selected them for her master's thesis on abandoned mining communities. Morales's thesis, titled Ghost Towns of the San Juans, Economic Decline or Unexplained Exodus, dedicated an entire chapter to Iron Peak. She was the first researcher to connect Phoebe's witness interviews with Dr. Jason White's medical journal, which had been discovered separately by his descendants and donated to a Denver museum. In a 1969 interview with the Rocky Mountain News, Morales stated, "What struck me most was the consistency of the accounts, multiple independent sources describing the same impossible events. These were educated, rational people, a physician, a teacher, a businesswoman, not prone to hysteria or superstition, yet their testimony describes events that defy natural explanation." Morales attempted to locate descendants of Iron Peak's residents to gather oral histories, but she encountered a strange pattern. Families who had connections to Iron Peak refused to discuss it. Multiple interview subjects hung up when she mentioned the town's name. One elderly woman whose grandmother had taught at the Iron Peak schoolhouse told her, "My grandmother made us promise never to speak of that place. She said some stories are better left buried." The next major discovery occurred in 1974, when a group of spelunkers exploring cave systems in the San Miguel Range accidentally broke through into the sealed chambers that Colonel Martin's massacre victims had been entombed within. Local authorities were called, and the caves were officially excavated for the first time since 1909. The county coroner's report, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1985, documented the remains of approximately 45 individuals of various ages and sexes, consistent with Native American ancestry. The report noted evidence of mass trauma consistent with explosive collapse and subsequent asphyxiation. But buried in the technical language was a detail that the coroner could not explain. 3 sets of remains appear significantly newer than the others. Estimated date of death circa early 20th century. Cause of death for these individuals shows extensive trauma to throat and thoracic cavity, with tool marks on bone consistent with large predator attack. However, no predator native to Colorado could produce marks of this size and depth. The DNA testing that would have definitively identified these 3 victims as Robert Anderson and his fellow miners was not yet available in 1974. The remains were catalogued, studied briefly, and then reburied in a mass grave at a cemetery in Silverton, marked only with a simple plaque reading, "Unknown Ute Victims and Others, 1867. Perhaps the most chilling discovery came in 1981, when a local historian named Gerald Hutchins was researching his family genealogy. He discovered that his great-grandfather, David Hutchins, had been 10 years old in 1909 and had lived in Iron Peak until its abandonment. David Hutchins had died in 1963, but before his death, he had recorded an audio testimony for his family, stored on a reel-to-reel tape that Gerald found in his parents' attic. The tape had degraded significantly, with portions barely audible, but what remained was startling. "I was there the night they all left," David's elderly voice crackled through the static. March 21st. The full moon. The colonel came out of the mountains, but he wasn't the colonel anymore. He was something else, 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur, but walking upright like a man. I watched from my bedroom window. He went to every house, scratching at the doors, and people came out. Not fighting, just following, like he was calling them. The tape hissed with interference before David's voice returned. "Miss Mitchell, the teacher." She tried to stop him. She stood in front of the schoolhouse with a Bible, reading verses. The colonel stopped. For a moment, I thought she'd succeeded. But then he spoke. In a human voice, but wrong, broken. He said, "The debt must be paid. Come willingly or come screaming, but come you must." She went with him. They all did. Every miner, every family that depended on the mine, marching into the forest, following the creature. Another burst of static. "My father worked the general store. We didn't depend on the mine directly. When the colonel reached our house, he paused, sniffed at the door, then moved on. In the morning, the town was empty. The boarding house lady, Miss Davis, and the doctor, they were gone too. I found Miss Davis's journal in her room, saw what she'd written about the colonel and the caves. My parents packed everything that day. We never went back." Gerald Hutchins attempted to verify his great-grandfather's account, but found only dead ends. Census records showed that 237 people had been registered as Iron Peak residents in early 1909. By the 1910 census, only 14 families claimed any connection to the settlement, and all had relocated to other towns. The remaining 180-plus individuals simply vanished from historical records. No mass graves beyond the caves have ever been discovered. No bodies were found in the forest surrounding Iron Peak, despite multiple search efforts over the decades. It was as if nearly 200 people had walked into the mountains and ceased to exist. In 1988, a journalist named Patricia Vance published an article in Colorado Heritage magazine titled "The Town That Walked Away." She compiled every known account, document and testimony related to Iron Peak's disappearance. Her conclusion was necessarily speculative but haunting. We are left with three possibilities. First, that the entire community participated in some form of mass exodus, abandoning their homes and possessions to escape a perceived threat, then deliberately erased their connection to Iron Peak from public records. Second, that a natural disaster or epidemic not documented in official records claimed most of the population, with survivors fabricating supernatural explanations to cope with trauma. Third, that something happened in Iron Peak that defies rational explanation, something so disturbing that the few survivors spent the rest of their lives ensuring the truth stayed buried. The ruins of Iron Peak remain accessible to hikers, though few visit despite the lack of official restrictions. The site has a reputation among locals as cursed ground. Park rangers report that wildlife avoids the area even during migrations. On several occasions, hikers have reported hearing howls echoing from the mountains on nights when the moon is full, howls that sound almost human. In 2003, a team of paranormal investigators attempted to spend a full moon night at the Iron Peak ruins. Their equipment captured audio anomalies and unexplained temperature fluctuations. One investigator claimed to see a large figure moving through the trees on two legs, watching their camp from the forest edge. They left before sunrise and refused to return. The caves themselves were sealed again in 1975 after the excavation, deemed too unstable for public access. But according to maintenance records from the National Forest Service, the seals have been found broken on multiple occasions, always following nights with a full moon. Rangers attribute this to natural weathering or vandalism. They do not explain the massive claw marks found on the concrete barriers. To this day, the official explanation for Iron Peak's abandonment remains economic collapse following mine closure. This explanation appears in history books, tourism guides, and academic papers. Those who know better stay silent, or they speak in whispers late at night, when the moon is dark and the mountains seem to listen. So we return to the question that has haunted researchers, historians, and paranormal investigators for over a century. What really happened in Iron Peak on the night of March 21st, 1909? The documented evidence presents us with fragments, not answers. Phoebe Davis's meticulous journals, Dr. Jason White's medical records, Sarah Mitchell's letters, the testimony of young David Hutchins, recorded decades after the events, the archaeological findings in the caves, the town's sudden, complete abandonment. Each piece of evidence is verifiable and authentic, yet together they construct a narrative that reason struggles to accept. Let me present you with the theories that have emerged over the years, each attempting to explain the inexplicable. Theory 1. Mass hysteria and voluntary exodus. Some historians argue that Iron Peak fell victim to collective delusion, exacerbated by isolation, economic anxiety, and possibly environmental factors. Colonel Martin, suffering from an undiagnosed degenerative brain condition, may have experienced violent episodes that the community misinterpreted through the lens of frontier folklore and Native American legends. The transformations, the supernatural elements, all could have been projections of mass hysteria. When Martin's behavior became too threatening, the community may have made a collective decision to abandon the settlement, fabricating the supernatural narrative to justify their flight, and later maintaining silence out of shame or trauma. This theory is favored by academic institutions and appears in most official historical accounts. It is rational, evidence-based, and requires no suspension of natural laws. It also fails to explain the massive claw marks found throughout the ruins. the bodies discovered in the caves with trauma inconsistent with any known predator, or why nearly 200 people would abandon all their possessions and systematically erase themselves from historical records. Theory 2. The curse was real. The second theory accepts the supernatural premise that runs through every eyewitness account, that the Ute shaman's dying curse was genuine, that Colonel Edmund Martin truly transformed into something between man and wolf, and that on March 21st, 1909, he completed his terrible work. According to this interpretation, Martin successfully lured or forced most of Iron Peak's population into the mountains, fulfilling the curse's requirement of 43 lives to balance the original massacre. The victims were not killed, but claimed, transformed, consumed, or absorbed into whatever dark power the shaman had invoked. Phoebe Davis, Dr. White, and Sarah Mitchell, having entered the sacred caves and disturbed the dead, became marked by the curse themselves. Despite not working the mind directly, they were taken along with the others, their fate sealed by their investigation. This theory explains the complete disappearance, the lack of bodies, and the continuing reports of anomalous activity at the Iron Peak ruins. It suggests that the curse remains active, that Colonel Martin, or what he became, still walks the mountains on nights when the moon is full, eternally hunting, eternally collecting. The debt. Believers in this theory point to the consistent reports from multiple independent witnesses, the physical evidence of the claw marks, and the fact that the few survivors were exclusively those with no direct connection to the mining operation. Theory 3. Something else entirely. There exists a third possibility, one rarely discussed in academic circles, but whispered among those who study frontier disappearances and unexplained events. Perhaps the curse itself was a misinterpretation. Perhaps the Ute shaman did not create the horror, but warned against awakening something that already existed in those mountains, something ancient and territorial that the massacre disturbed. Colonel Martin may have been not the cursed, but the conduit, the first to be claimed by an entity that had waited in the sealed caves for decades. When those caves were reopened in 1909, when Martin's control finally broke completely, the entity emerged, not to exact revenge, but simply to reclaim what had always been its domain. The systematic nature of the disappearances, the targeting of those who violated the sacred ground, the complete erasure of victims, these suggest not a curse following rules, but an intelligence making choices. Under this theory, something still resides in those mountains, something that has learned to mimic human form well enough to avoid detection. Something that emerges during full moons, not because of lunar influence, but because that is when it chooses to hunt. The broken seals on the caves, the continuing howls, the wildlife that refuses to enter the area, the hikers who report being watched from the tree line, not echoes of the past, active warnings in the present. Which theory do you believe? Or do you have one of your own that might explain what happened to Iron Peak's lost souls? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Our haunted community thrives on different perspectives, and your theories might illuminate corners of this mystery that remain shrouded in darkness. The truth is that we may never know with certainty what transpired on that March night over a century ago. The witnesses are gone. The town is ruins. The official records are sanitized or missing entirely. All that remains are the fragments, the whispers, and the warnings. What we do know is this. Something in the Colorado mountains claimed nearly 200 lives in a single night and left behind evidence that continues to disturb those who encounter it. Whether that something was a cursed man, a vengeful spirit, or an ancient entity beyond our comprehension, the result is the same. Iron Peak is gone, its people are gone, And to this day, on nights when the moon is full, those who dare to visit the ruins sometimes hear howls echoing through the valleys, howls that sound almost human, almost pleading, as if the victims are still calling out from wherever they were taken, as if the midnight howler is still hunting. If you found this investigation compelling, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell. Every week, we delve into another forgotten case, another buried truth, another shadow in America's historical record that refuses to stay hidden. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, some debts are never fully paid, some curses never truly break, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. This has been your journey into the archives. I'll see you in the next investigation. Welcome to our haunted community.